This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, emerging markets were pretty flat today, tracking weakness in Wall Street as lawmakers in Washington struggle to reach an agreement on the stimulus ahead of today's deadline. Chinese stocks did lend some support to MSCI's index of emerging market equities as optimism over strong consumption in the country invited some buying into risky assets today. But South Africa's main stock index ending a two-day rally today. Standard Bank Group fell 0.9%, and that weighed on the banking index. That's after the company's results in the first 9 months of 2020 saw cost growth outpacing gains in revenue. Sasol also falling as much as 4.5% today, and that is after OPEC Plus warned of a precarious outlook for the oil market. Now, also coming up on today's show. Sudan transfers compensation money in compliance with U.S. conditions to be lifted off a terror list. China inches closer to finalizing trials for a COVID-19 vaccine. And Uganda's Tugende loans that seek to lift motorcycle riders into entrepreneurship. Well, let's begin today's show in Sudan. The North African nation has transferred the compensation which it agreed to pay U.S. victims of militant attacks and, of course, their families. Now, Sudan's central bank governor, Mohamed Al-Fatih Zine al-Abidine, has confirmed that the payment of $335 million US has been made. The transfer is part of a deal with Washington to get Sudan off its list of state sponsors of terrorism. On Tuesday, Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok said he was ready to pay. He welcomed plans by U.S. President Donald Trump to drop that terrorism listing.
Negotiations over a deal to remove Sudan from a list of state sponsors of terrorism have been ongoing for years now. The United States added Sudan to its list in 1993. The U.S. believed Omar al-Bashir's government was supporting militant groups. Additional sanctions have hampered efforts by Sudan's transitional government to revive the economy.
Last year, we started a serious discussion with the American administration to remove Sudan's name from the list of countries sponsoring terrorism. I spent the whole of last year in constant contact with the Sudanese people, telling you that we have come close to this moment, the moment of removing Sudan's name from that list. And today, this was achieved. We were able to reverse these punishments from $10 billion US or more to a few hundred million.
On Monday, through a tweet, President Donald Trump signaled that America could lift Sudan from the list, hailing it as a big step for the people of Sudan. U.S.-Sudanese negotiations have focused on compensation that Washington wants Khartoum to pay to victims of al-Qaeda attacks on U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. The terror listing has been a major hurdle for Sudan to access foreign financing.
This decision qualifies Sudan to get relief from debt. We are today more than $60 billion US in debt. With this decision, doors open that allow for the relief of Sudan's debt.
Many in Sudan feel the decision has been overdue. They say Bashir was removed last year, and Sudan has long cooperated with the United States on counter-terrorism.
The Sudanese people have never supported terrorism. That was something linked to the old regime. We are a peaceful people, and we hope that thanks to your help, Sudan will be removed from that list.
The deal could also set in motion steps by Sudan toward establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, following similar U.S.-brokered moves in recent weeks by the UAE and Bahrain. But a key sticking point in talks has been Sudan's insistence that any announcement of Khartoum's delisting not be explicitly linked to normalization with Israel. Re-establishing relations between Israel and another Arab country would give Trump a new diplomatic achievement as he seeks re-election on the 3rd of November. Chom Hono, CGTN.
Well, let's now get more details on that deal from Giles Gibson. He's in Washington. And from Cairo, Dr. Gamal Abdel Gawad. He's a senior research fellow at Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. Great to have both of you with us on the show today. And I'll start off with you, Giles. Now, this deal is not just about removing Sudan from that list. It could also include normalizing relations with Israel, as well as providing aid to the country and even debt forgiveness going forward. So what do we know so far about the details of that deal?
In President Trump's tweet that he put out on Monday, he was very clear that Sudan had agreed to pay $335 million in compensation to the families of the victims of the attacks on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania back in 1998, as well as the USS Cole warship in 2000. Now, what was notably absent from that tweet was any mention of Sudan recognizing Israel. And the State Department throughout this process has said very clearly that these two issues, the state sponsor of terror list and recognizing Israel, are two very separate issues that they've been discussing separately. But when Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, went to Khartoum in August, we heard off the record from Sudanese officials that the US Secretary of State had made clear, a very clear quid pro quo, that recognizing Israel would get Sudan off this list of state sponsors of terror.
Now, Dr. Gamal, as we heard there, this deal may contain quite a lot in it, including allowing international financial assistance to finally flow back into Sudan. So give us an insight into what led this new government to this point. Of course, the point of accepting to pay compensation for the Kenya and Tanzania bombings, and of course, possibly a deal now normalizing relations with Israel.
Well, this government in the Sudan inherited a very heavy legacy of the former regime. The former regime, since it came in power in late 1980s, aligned itself with radical terrorist groups, particularly Islamist groups, around the region. Early in the 1990s, the Sudan hosted Osama bin Laden. The Sudan hosted the Venezuelan terrorist, the famous one, Carlos. There has been attempt on the life of the Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, organized in the Sudan, and the attack was made in Addis Ababa. So there was a lot of involvement of the former government in terrorism. But really what hurt the government, the implication in attacks on U.S. interests in the late 1980s, 1990s, 98 in particular. There were the attacks on the American embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and in Nairobi, Kenya, where a large number of people were killed. And this case was taken to the court, and there was a court ruling by one of the American courts fining the Sudanese government billions of dollars, actually. So the American government added Sudan to the list of terrorist nations, and there was a number of issues here. Being on the list of terrorist nations and having to pay those fines or those compensations for the relatives of the victims who have been killed in the attacks in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam. And now with the new government in power, 18 months now, they haven't been really able to handle the Sudanese economy in deep trouble, taking into consideration this American sanctions on the Sudan. They had to clear this issue. Successfully, they negotiated with the Trump administration, reducing the fine or the compensations from 10 billion to little more than 200 million. So something reasonable for the Sudanese government that now able to pay, which already did, hoping that this will reintegrate Sudan in the international community and the taking benefits from possible transactions and development assistance, etc. Right. So the Sudanese government currently is really putting a lot of hope on the outcome of this deal.
Right, it's most certainly an economic move for the new government. But Giles, Trump has not yet formally notified Congress, and of course lawmakers could block it. Can we expect any opposition to a deal going forward, especially now as politics clouds the conversation in the run-up to elections?
Well, President Trump can actually remove Sudan from the state sponsor of terror list. He just has to notify the Congress here in Washington that he's doing so. But the Congress also needs to pass a piece of legislation that's currently working its way through Congress that would shield Sudan from future claims about other terrorist attacks. And there's a lot of concern, particularly in the US Senate amongst Senate Democrats, that piece of legislation would stop victims' families from suing over other attacks, including, of course, the 9/11 attacks in 2001. Sudan is, of course, accused of sheltering leaders of Al-Qaeda.
Well, Dr. Gamal, I'll come back to you. And as you mentioned, it's mostly an economic move for this new government. Sudan needs it. It has been overwhelmed by high inflation and food and fuel shortages, of course, all worsened by COVID-19 and recent flooding. Tell us more about what this new deal will mean for the country's economy.
Well, I think a few figures would help give us some idea about how the economic situation in the Sudan look like. We talk about inflation in the vicinity of 200. We talk about unemployment of over 60%. We talk about more than $60 billion of foreign debt. We talk about a deterioration in the exchange rate and the value of the Sudanese pound coming down from vis-a-vis the dollar from about 80 to 280 pounds for one dollar. So it's really, the economic situation is very difficult. If you visit Khartoum, you will it's very frequent to see long lines of people waiting for to obtain some bread needed for their families, or to put gas on their automobiles. So the situation is very difficult. And let us keep in mind here that the government in the Sudan is not strong enough to take the hard measures needed to let us say, lead the country out of this economic crisis. A transitional government that is based essentially on a broad coalition where everybody wants a piece of the economic dividends of the revolution. So the government in Sudan didn't really have enough political support to take the austerity measures needed to lead Sudan out of that. So Sudan is looking forward to additional resources coming from the outside, things that could be possible now as a result of the deal with the United States. Sudan is looking for more developmental assistance, more of debt relief, possibilities of some foreign direct investment coming to the country. So some additional help that would keep the vehicle of the Sudanese economy moving. Hopefully that down the road they can streamline the problems and deal with the structural problems that the Sudanese economy is facing.
Well, we do have to leave the discussion there. Many thanks to both of you. That's Dr. Gamal Abdel Gawad joining us there in Cairo, and of course Giles Gibson in Washington. Well, let's Let's now turn our attention to some corporate headlines. South Africa's Standard Bank says its loan book has remained under strain in the third quarter, and that's amid an increase in retrenchment claims. In an update for the 9 months to end September, the group said that customers remained under stress, resulting in an increase in non-performing loans and additional impairment charges. However, initial indications are that collections have improved relative to the second quarter. Meanwhile, retail chain Pick n Pay is set to open its first store in Nigeria through a partnership with AG Levantis. This is in an effort to tap into the West African nation's underserved consumer market. The push into Nigeria comes as retailers withdraw because of currency devaluations, as well as logistical challenges and difficulties repatriating their funds. And Netflix has sought to show more African-made content, and it's working with telecoms operators to make it easier for potential subscribers to make payments. The streaming giant is keen to expand in Africa and is now seeking ways to overcome challenges, including slow and expensive internet and the lack of proper payments infrastructure on the continent. And the U.S. Justice Department and 11 states have filed an antitrust lawsuit against Alphabet's Google for allegedly breaking the law in using its market power to fend off rivals. Now, Google, whose search engine is so predominant that its name has become a verb, had revenue of $162 billion in 2019. That's more than the nation of Hungary. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let's take a short break now. Still to come. Sudan transfers compensation money in compliance with U.S. conditions. And South Africa records a surge in online commerce as more people work from home.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home, and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Now, private equity has remained resilient in Africa despite the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the Africa Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, $1.1 billion worth of funds were raised in the first half of this year, and about 81 deals were reported worth about $700 million US. Now, North Africa attracted the largest share of private equity deals, both by volume and value, at 31% and 42% respectively, followed by West Africa representing 21% of the deal volumes and 22% of the deal values. Healthcare, information technology, and financials were the top three sectors by deal value, accounting for 54% of the total deal value in the first half of 2020. Now, financials, information technology, and consumer discretionary were the most active sectors by deal volume during that period. They attracted 49% of the total deal volume. Well, let's take apart that report further with Dara Oyemi. She is the interim CEO of the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Great to have you on the show with us, Dara. Now, of course, looking at your report, you say the industry has demonstrated its resilience. It raised about $1.1 billion of funds so far this year, but there has clearly been a slowdown in activity. We've seen the value of private equity deals is on pace for a 63% drop compared to last year. Were these numbers expected, Dara, and do you foresee similar levels through the rest of the year?
Thank you very much for having me. As is the case globally, the COVID-19 pandemic has had significant impact on economies across the globe, and we've seen significant slowdown across various markets, and Africa has not been immune from this, neither have the private equity industry been immune. What we have seen in the first half of the year is, despite the slowdown, fund managers have raised $1.1 billion in funds for investments on the continent, as this compares to $1.7 billion that was raised in the similar period in 2019. Regardless, it's important to note that at the onset of the pandemic, fund managers took the approach to focus on managing their portfolio companies through this COVID-19 period. And as a result, we saw a slowdown in activity. But what we do expect to see in the second half of the year and beyond is an increase in activities as fund managers go back to focusing on investing and exiting businesses that they had invested in.
Now, interestingly, private equity exits, they slowed down, only 13 recorded in the first half. Why is that?
Again, just similar to the point made earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic has created significant uncertainty in the market in the first half of the year. Fund managers, took the approach to really spend time with their portfolio companies to understand what the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic would be on their portfolio companies, and just took the approach of by focusing on those companies in the first half of the year, there is now a better understanding of the impact that COVID-19 has had on individual companies. And now, that the environment is a little bit clearer, we do expect to see more exits come through the rest of the year and into 2021. But, in line with what we've seen in other markets, there has been a slowdown in exits. But again, we do expect to see more exits coming through in the coming months.
Now, as we mentioned, healthcare actually took nearly a quarter of all the private equity deals done by value. Is this reflective of the pandemic and, of course, COVID-19, or was this a trend already showing up in the industry? And, of course, there's been a lot of interest in Africa's tech ecosystem. Could we see this trend change as Africa's tech ecosystem grows?
Yes, and very interesting question. The healthcare sector was the fourth most active in the first half of 2021. And in terms of value, it had the largest share of value of PE deals in the first half of 2020 rather. If we go back to data from 2014, we actually do have increasingly seen an increase in activity in the healthcare sector. And, if there's anything that the COVID-19 pandemic has done is really stretch healthcare systems around the world. So we do expect to see, and especially as the healthcare sector has been brought to the fore, we expect to see more and more activity in the sector going forward. In the first half of 2020, what we've seen is investments in healthcare, companies providing services, equipment, and we've also seen investments in the biotech and pharmaceutical sectors of the healthcare industry. We expect to see more and more activity in innovative companies that are providing solutions within the sector in the coming months and years.
Now, another interesting observation is that very little of this capital is actually flowing into the rest of the continent, sub-Saharan Africa. Most of that capital has been invested in North Africa and a few other West African and advanced economies on the continent. Why is that? Can we expect that to change anytime soon?
Yeah, so in the first half of 2020, North Africa took the lion's share of transactions by volume and value, closely followed by West Africa, East Africa, and then South Africa. But as you will appreciate, this actually changes quarter on quarter, half year, or even on a yearly basis. So if we look at the 2019 data, South Africa had the largest share by volume and value. If we go back to 2014 through to today, West Africa has attracted the largest share of deals by volume and value. What we do know is that a significant majority of the funds that have been invested on the continent have been invested in key markets such as Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa. But we're also seeing increasing interest in a number of markets outside of the key markets that I mentioned. So, for example, in East Africa, we're seeing significant interest in markets such as Ethiopia. In West Africa, we're seeing significant interest across Francophone Africa. And if I can even just mention that in markets such as Egypt, we are beginning to see Egypt emerge as a VC hub with significant number of VC transactions happening in that particular region. So, I mean, we do expect to see, again, in the coming year and next year, we expect to see more and more activity, over the entire period. But certainly, there are several new markets that are providing interesting opportunities for investors. There are 150 plus fund managers who are actively investing on the continent and investing across various sectors, industries, and various strategies. And we just expect to see more and more fund managers emerge over time. Right. And with the emergence of new fund managers, we expect to see more and more activities in the coming year.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to see that full year report. That, of course, is Dara Oyemi. She is the interim CEO at the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Well, moving on now, e-commerce has enjoyed a sudden growth spurt in South Africa. While online trade has been active in the country for over a decade now, there's been a sudden surge in activity this year. Well, Sumitra Naidu reports from Johannesburg.
South African consumers have been slower in their online activity compared to some countries in Africa and in the West. But online behavior made a dramatic shift this year as COVID-19 forced a hard lockdown.
We've seen what we're calling a once-in-a-generation shift to e-commerce and online sales. South Africa has always been a relatively small market when it comes to e-commerce, roughly 1% of online sales. We've seen that almost double now in the space of less than 12 months.
Shoprite Checkers launched 6060 just before the virus arrived in South Africa. The online shopping app now has over 5 million users, and these customers signed up in the last 12 months.
The real underlying factor is that people discovered the convenience of online retail during lockdown. So once you make your first online grocery order, for example, and it arrives and you get what you wanted, and you realize just how convenient it is, how quick it is, and how much it reduces the complexity of your life, then suddenly you become hooked.
South Africa is in no way lacking technology and innovation, but trust created a lag in customer take-up.
The only challenge that you sit with is somebody trusting a payment gateway that will not steal the banking details. Then you get to the rural areas where that is still going to take a bit of time because it's education one, infrastructure secondly, and if you look at rural areas, it's a cash-based system.
The hard lockdown and social distancing measures forced many to set aside their fears and shop online.
The lockdown has actually lifted the thought process of small and medium entrepreneurs. Let me put things on a platform where it opens borders without being there physically.
When the lockdown was announced, there's an entire generation now that wanted to try online shopping for the first time. So we've seen, for example, more than 20% of 6060 shoppers are actually older than 50. We have over 100 people that are over 80 that are using the app on a weekly basis.
Rand Merchant Bank estimates e-commerce in South Africa will be worth around $14 billion in just 5 years. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
You are watching Global Business Africa. We're going to take a quick break now, but still coming up. China inches closer to finalizing trials for a COVID-19 vaccine. And we give you a feel of Beijing in a driverless car.
taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time, it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Half past the hour, let's recap other headlines at this time. The transitional government in Sudan says it is ready to cooperate with the International Criminal Court. Now, the ICC's prosecutor is in the Sudanese capital of Khartoum for 4 days of talks with Sudan's government over alleged war crimes committed by former President Omar al-Bashir in the Darfur region. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, armed men have freed more than 1,300 prisoners from a jail in the eastern part of the country. The local mayor has blamed an Islamist militant group that operates in the area for the coordinated attack early Tuesday. A similar attack occurred at the same jail back in 2017. And Ecommerce has dispatched a crisis mission to Côte d'Ivoire to counter rising tensions as election campaigns continue. Now, the tense political climate comes ahead of a presidential election at the end of the month. And finally, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed says his administration's prime job is guaranteeing peace and security for its citizens. Addressing lawmakers in a parliament, Abiy also said despite COVID-19 challenges, the country has registered 6.1% economic growth. And that's a recap of today's top headlines. And now to some international news. New breakthroughs have been made in the battle against COVID-19 as China doubles down in the global race to develop an effective vaccine. Several vaccines are in the final trials in the country and are already reporting positive results. Here's Feng Yile with more.
As more COVID-19 vaccines from across the world are reaching the final stage of testing on humans, 4 Chinese candidates have disclosed their initial results. Chinese officials say the vaccines appear safe after some 60,000 volunteers took part in the trials, and developments won't be halted by mutations of the virus.
In the earlier stages of clinical trials in China, we identified some mild adverse reactions, including pain and swelling at the site of the injection and a transient fever. Now, as the trials have entered the third phase, basically, we've monitored mild side effects and no serious adverse reactions have been reported. The overall situation is relatively good.
China expects to have an annual production of 610 million COVID-19 vaccines by the end of 2020 and plans to further expand that capacity next year to meet the huge demand. The country has already offered emergency use vaccines to protect those most at risk, such as medical workers and customs staff.
In terms of emergencies, China strictly follows the approved plan on the premise of voluntary, informed, and consented use. We've established a strict process in terms of screening volunteers, monitoring adverse reactions, emergency treatments, and post-vaccination tracking. So far, no serious adverse reactions have been reported among all the people receiving emergency vaccines, and no infections have been reported among those who got inoculated before working in high-risk areas.
Right now, Chinese drug makers are also conducting phase 3 trials in several other countries that severely suffer from the pandemic, especially developing countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, and America. That is part of efforts to make COVID-19 vaccines available to all, coming after the country joined COVAX, the global initiative against vaccine nationalism.
Although we're leading the world in vaccine development and have sufficient production capacity, we have decided to join COVAX. The main objective is to promote the equitable distribution of vaccines globally and to ensure that vaccines are available to developing countries. In addition, we also want to encourage other capable countries to join the initiative through our participation.
As the race for vaccine is on across the world, the final step of testing in China is to prove the efficacy and safety of all candidates before seeking approval from regulators. And the Chinese authorities say the country will fulfill its commitment to make any vaccine a global public good. And the aim is to curb the virus and its threat to the health and safety of all people of all countries. Feng Yilei, CGTN, Beijing.
Meanwhile, China recently released its third quarter economic data report. It indicated a 4.9% economic growth in the period of July to September this year. Now, Ahmedin Mohammed, the state minister at the Ministry of Innovation and Technology in Ethiopia, has deemed China's economic recovery as successful. He adds that China's e-commerce economy has been very successful in initiating innovative technology development.
Chinese economy has been one of the impressive success stories. China is a world leader in e-commerce. With the superior infrastructure of the Chinese and innovative logistics, I can say that the Chinese government or the Chinese e-commerce companies have successfully managed to take the e-commerce to the very rural area, which is the most challenging thing in other parts of the world. This is very much impressive. Chinese e-commerce is a huge success. So the Chinese e-commerce, the success behind the e-commerce contributes a lot to the Chinese economy.
China is set to become the first or the only real major substantive economy this year to grow in positive numbers, which is obviously very positive for the rest of us. Thinking back, I was in China 20 years ago during the height of SARS, and I think since that time, the lessons, the learnings that China's taken of how to manage crises caused by disease from SARS, it certainly has a blueprint or a template, if you will, as to how to manage those crises, and this is certainly evidence of it. And I think also since that time we've had multiple global crises, but China's seemingly become a crisis-resistant economy, and relatively speaking, it's showing it once again.
And the African Union's Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture is amongst those speaking highly of China's efforts to reduce poverty in the country.
The Chinese vision of reducing poverty is really, it's really an integrated program. China has made poverty reduction its highest priority. So when we are making a policy, you have to define what are the priorities. The second aspect, it follows the integrated approach, like I say, and comprehensive strategy, which are important to mitigate a complex problem such as poverty. And when I went to China, I visited provinces that were really poor, but the way if you go there today, it's become, an urban area, and people are happy. You brought all the technology, all the infrastructure, all the cultural values in that region, and people are not even keen to go and live, in Beijing or the big cities. So that was really a very, very good lesson. The tourism, the energy and agriculture, other sectors that you really develop. So I think we need to follow, this example, good example of a Chinese, to diversify our economy. We need to encourage our member states to follow the example of China.
Well, let's move on now. A new wave of COVID-19 infections is bringing more challenges to the aviation sector. Airlines around the world are now buckling up for another turbulent few months ahead. Here's CGTN's Trent Murray with more.
Few industries have been hit harder by the COVID-19 pandemic than aviation. Experts are forecasting a 66% drop in passenger numbers for this year. And with a second wave hitting much of Europe and North America, airline chiefs are sounding the alarm.
But I need to be clear that there is a risk that as an industry, we will not see beyond this crisis if we do not first address the issue of how we get people flying again.
Speaking at this year's Airlines 2050 Summit, The new CEO of British Airways said mandatory quarantine laws had decimated UK travel demand, pointing to the flag carrier's prestigious London to New York route as just one example.
We need to work together on a testing pilot so flights can start between London and New York, traditionally one of the busiest airline routes in the world. We normally fly to New York up to 12 times a day. It's now twice per day with fewer than 200 passengers most days. I cannot stress more greatly that air connectivity between the UK and USA is fundamental for supporting economic growth and trade on both sides of the Atlantic.
Lawmakers in London say they're listening, but have stopped short of agreeing to a full rollout for pre-flight airport testing.
I know some have promoted the idea that we should test at borders, but how do we have done so? But we have not done so, rather, because the Chief Medical Officer has made clear that it wouldn't capture sufficient information on those who are asymptomatically carrying the virus.
This lies in stark contrast to Germany's approach, with Frankfurt, Munich and Hamburg airports all administering thousands of passenger swabs each day, something experts say is helping passengers return to the skies.
The row over testing comes as more and more airlines report major financial difficulties as their planes continue to sit grounded right around the world. And while it will be some time yet before the industry returns to clear skies, there is some hope that months of forced lockdown measures may just fuel a future surge in flight bookings.
Qatar Airways CEO Akbar El-Bakr is particularly confident about the future.
People will want to travel again, experience the world, meet friends and family, as well as business travel restarting. In many ways, the restrictions have made people realize how precarious the ability to travel really is, and was perhaps taken for granted.
But with many borders remaining closed and infections still rising, airlines around the world remain buckled up for a turbulent few months ahead. Trent Murray, CGTN.
Meanwhile, the first ever official United Arab Emirates delegation is flying to Israel. The group is accompanied by U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and the U.S. Middle East envoy. They're expected to sign a deal on flights between Israel and the UAE. Now, this comes after the U.S. brokered normalization of ties between the countries last month. The UAE is the first Arab state in decades to establish formal relations with the Jewish state. After Bahrain and Israel formalized ties on Sunday, it's the UAE's turn to further cement those relations. While CGTN's Jacob Greaves now looks at one potential area for cooperation: diamonds.
Links between the UAE and Israel are growing. Last week saw a cargo ship from Dubai arrive in Israel, cementing a trade route.
We are delighted to welcome you on this first commercial flight to Israel.
Abu Dhabi's Etihad says it's now operated the first passenger flight from a Gulf airline to Israel. But diamonds could also add a sparkle to future ties after a recent memorandum of understanding signed between the Dubai and Israeli diamond exchanges. Since, traders in Dubai say they've been inundated with inquiries from Israelis. A major destination for the diamonds sold here in Dubai is the polishing market in India. The normalisation of ties with Israel could open new avenues.
We all understood that the missing link actually in that business are the Israelis. The Israelis always played a big role in the diamond industry, and to become what I believe Dubai is going to become, the biggest center in the world, I think that the fact that the Israelis could not come here and had difficulties to come here will change. I mean, it's for me, it's a game changer.
It could help link the two largest diamond markets in the Middle East. Israel's exchange says its trade amounted to $12 billion last year. In Dubai, that figure is $21.2 billion, according to the Dubai Multi-Commodities Centre. For them, normalisation means the potential to reel in new business. They say numerous Israelis have been in touch about setting up shop.
What I'm really looking forward to see more of coming from Israel is the technology businesses, the security, and when I say security, I'm talking about the ones that are related to diamonds. You have sarin and others.
From the Israeli perspective, it also provides a gateway to the Gulf.
We have the opportunity to make partnership with them, and they will get into Saudi Arabia, Oman, and many other Arab countries that Israeli until today couldn't reach.
With the UAE's massive cargo ports already seen as a Gulf entry point, a similar principle could apply to broader trade and business. But all of this might depend on the scale and the speed of normalisation. For one, visa arrangements between the two countries are still yet to be announced. Diamonds might be an area for potential bilateral growth, but the finer details of this deal have yet to go under the microscope. Jacob Greaves, CGTN in Dubai.
Now, China's search engine giant Baidu has rolled out its Apollo Go robotaxi services in Beijing. It allows passengers to take the self-driving cabs without reservations. So what does a driverless taxi look like, and how exactly does it feel to take it? Well, our Yu Yang has the details.
This is Apollo Go, autonomous driving taxi I've just hailed by my phone. To hail it, all I had to do was click autonomous driving here in the Baidu Maps app, and then choose my starting point and destination. C, to hail Apollo Go. Currently, people in Beijing can only order free test rides at cab ranks only in some high-tech areas of Haidian districts in the west and Yizhuang in the south. And the journey needs to be start and finish at fixed pickup and drop-off sites. So getting into the car, you may find that there indeed somebody is sitting in the driver's seat. But he's not the real driver, he's here for security concerns. Hello, Mr. Guo. 各位师傅您好。所以我们现在能走了吗？ Great, let's start. Now you can see the driver's hands is not touching the steering wheel. A steering wheel is all turning by itself. It's really magic, it's amazing. These robot taxis were co-produced by Chinese artificial intelligence giant Baidu and the car makers Hongqi and Lincoln. And finally, I arrived here at my destination. It's a short journey, but it's very interesting. So how does these robot taxis work? Baidu's experts told us before a driverless car can be allowed to leave the garage, it has to be able to detect its surroundings. A cap-like device on the roof of the car includes laser radar, which is used to detect curbs. Cameras on the car body are used to detect traffic lights and road signs. And sonar is used to find other cars around it. These are the basic conditions needed to keep a driverless car moving. Autonomous driving has become one of the investment priorities for Chinese companies in recent years, and this could also be the driving style of the future. Yu Yang, CGTN, Beijing.
And shifting focus now, here's a quick look at commodity markets today. Gold prices easing, trading in a narrow range today. Now, according to traders, caution set in ahead of the deadline to reach an agreement on a new U.S. stimulus package and, of course, the upcoming presidential election. Oil prices, on the other hand, down today on worries that a resurgence of coronavirus cases is stifling a recovery in fuel demand, while we're seeing growing Libyan output adding to an already plentiful supplied market. Now, a meeting on Monday of OPEC Plus pledged to support the oil market as concerns grow over soaring coronavirus cases. Well, let's take a quick break now, still to come. We look at the Ugandan startup that's offering motorcycle riders a chance to win bikes.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Admin Shuishi, Tunis, Cairo,
Juba, Johannesburg,
Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Now, in Nigeria, 65,000 farmers stand to benefit from a $20.4 million grant from the MasterCard Foundation. Now, the grant is aimed at helping the agriculture sector to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and withstand future crises such as climate change. Here's CGTN's Terry Wangari with more.
Mary Daniel weeds by hand a field dotted with trees and scraggly sesame plants. A widow with 7 children, she's among the 70% of Nigerians employed in agriculture. She's grown sesame, maize and cassava her whole life, but coronavirus lockdown forced her to abandon her 3 hectares.
This coronavirus stopped us from activities and going to the farm and market. We stayed at home and everything became standstill. We couldn't even buy food because the markets were closed because of coronavirus.
Daniel is now among 65,000 Nigerian farmers who will access tractors, seeds, fertilizer and finance from a $20.4 million grant from the MasterCard Foundation. Under the arrangement, some 200 tractors, 330,000 kilograms of seeds, climate advisories and digital payment systems will enable farmers like Daniel to help feed the nation of nearly 200 million people.
I farm between 2 to 3 hectares and I get over 20 bags of sesame seeds in a year. But since they've helped us this year, I will have a bumper harvest.
Despite years of government attention and millions of dollars in targeted central bank loans, Nigeria's farms have low yields. Less than 1% of farmland is irrigated. Many work the fields by hand and can't access fertilizer or high-quality seeds.
We're bringing farmers together in what we call community blocks so that they can support each other. They are not too far away from each other. Secondly, this is going to be for the long haul. It's a sustainability approach to it. It's a long-term project to grow their farm businesses and to make them more efficient at what they do.
The grant has helped farmers like Mary Daniel take care of her family during these unprecedented times.
If this system had not been introduced, I would have been suffering now, because there wouldn't have been food to eat or money to take my children to school. But this came and helped us to farm and have food and money to pay my children's school fees.
According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the average Nigerian farmer has 1.8 hectares. This new project will group them into 500-hectare collectives to create economies of scale. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
Now, Toyota Group's trading arm has invested $4 million in a Ugandan startup, Tugende. The project aims to offer small loans for businessmen in the informal sector and provide financing for customers hoping to purchase Toyota vehicles. Here's CGTN's Chao Mgono with that report.
Mark Yahweh, like many young businessmen in the informal sector, has turned to commercial banks in hopes of securing a loan to boost his business. He has not always been successful. This time, however, Yahweh is one of the few who get to access a financing facility from Ugandan company Tugende. He's been making a living by driving someone else's bike for the last 3 years. With a down payment at Tugende, he gets to ride his own bike and can start building his business.
For the terms and conditions, I find them to be favorable because when I go to a private motorcycle owner, he gives me a motorbike to ride on a rent basis. Yet, when I come to Tugende, they give me a motorbike with taxes paid.
Launched in 2012, Tugende offers motorcycle mortgages to riders. But the bikers only receive the logbook after the final payment is made. With banks reluctant to lend money to small or informal businesses in Africa due to the high rate of defaulting, clients like Yahweh have a second option.
They don't have adequate financial access to the banks, traditional banks, and so on. And so because of that problem, let's say, the challenge in the financial access, so those micro SMEs or individual business entrepreneurs have a difficulty to expand their businesses and so on. And then we believe this has to be solved.
After a client takes all of the trainings, they move to a field-based screening where they have to pay a small application fee, and then our team goes and visits them at their place of work and at their home. And we're looking for people who already have business experience.
With an asset base of $30 million, Tugende has handed out about 35,000 bike mortgages so far, a small fraction of the Ugandan market, estimated at 800,000 riders.
What we've realized is that there is an enormous demand for credit for small and medium businesses across Africa, and it's very difficult for them to access credit from most standard banks, and even a lot of technology-led lenders are small loans and very expensive. So the Tugende model is all about helping people own income-generating assets where the cash flow they make from their entrepreneurial activities can pay a loan or a mortgage or a hire purchase lease so that they go from renting to owning in a short period of time.
Payments are made via cell phone mobile money service and other digital platforms. Clients like John Anario say he has been able to expand his transportation business.
I got a car from Tugende of 21 million on lease. I driven it. After driving it, I paid it in cash. I completed the lease of the car, and I came back for the bike which I have now. So what I benefited from Tugende, it's too much.
According to a 2017 report by the International Finance Corporation, the financing gap for micro, small and medium enterprises in sub-Saharan Africa is estimated at $331 billion. Tugende hopes to expand its existing motorcycle mortgages, grow its new motor vehicle financing product, and go to new markets in the region. Chom Hono, CGTN.
And before we leave you, here's a quick look at Africa's currencies today. Not much movement in South Africa's rand, as of course focus remains on US politics. It did hover at around 16.5 rand per dollar, as we are seeing EU and US political and economic affairs continuing to weigh on sentiment. Nigeria's naira, not much change today on the parallel market. It traded at 460 naira per dollar. It did strengthen slightly on the official NAFEX market, and that's after depreciating at the NAFEX window yesterday, as of course the hashtag #EndSARS camp protests continue to escalate in the country. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.